As heirs to the climate of the future, the youth are a critical stakeholder in climate change and therefore the negotiations surrounding climate change. Many people also look to the youth for hope to come with new ideas to help us solve the current problems we're facing. But furthermore, given the distant nature of the long-term targets and pledges made at, for example, COP, the burden also of solving a lot of these problems falls to the youth. Despite all this, the youth are also a group that often feel that their voices aren't heard. So today, at the final session at the Nordic Pavilion, we're going to have with us guests here, both in Glasgow and in Helsinki, representing different youth voices. Hello, my name is Aaron Tucky, and I'm here today on behalf of the Nordic Council of Ministers. I work actually, though, at the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency in Stockholm. The Nordic Council of Ministers sees and recognizes the importance of a youth perspective, and this is one of 3 interdisciplinary approaches that we see touch on all activities of the Nordic Council of Ministers. So again, fitting that this is our final event today at the Pavilion. So we should have a live link coming up with Helsinki, and we'll shortly cross to Nadia Kochman in Helsinki to introduce our panel there. But I'd firstly like to make our panel welcome here in Glasgow, of course making everyone in the audience here in Glasgow, in Helsinki and streaming elsewhere online welcome as well. Hi Nadia, can we just test we've got a connection to you in Helsinki?
Hello. Hello, do you hear me?
I can hear you. Can we hear in the audience as well? Fantastic. Great, Nadia. So I'll start by introducing our panel here, and then I'd love to hear from you, Nadia, and the panel there. And then we're going to touch on 4 major topics today. Hopefully everyone will get a chance to say a few words on those topics. We're going to start by talking a bit about the expectations that we had coming to COP, that the youth members had coming to COP, talking about then some of the different roles that youth have played, representing a multitude of different organizations. Then looking at some of the major issues that you felt have come up, and then lastly looking at where do we go from here in the lead up to the next COP, for example. So I'd like to introduce our panel here. Starting on the left, we have, just check I've got everyone's names in front of me. Axel Eriksson from Push Sweden and the Nordic Council Delegate for Biodiversity. Then we have Maja Koivalainen, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Oh, good. Working on my Finnish still. The Finnish Youth Delegate for Climate Change. Then we have Finna Rikard Andersson, the Youth Climate Delegate for Iceland, and Amanda Björksad, the Youth Climate Delegate for Sweden. Nadia, who do we have in the room in Helsinki?
Hello, my name is Nadia, as Aaron already introduced me so nicely. We have 4 nice speakers here in Finland and Helsinki as well. So Isaac Parks from Regeneration 2030. Veera Arhippainen from, she is actually a student at the University of Helsinki. She studies global sustainability. Then we have Joel Algren from Global Utmaning, and Adalbjörg Egilsdottir from the Icelandic Youth Environmental Association, and she has also been one of our key listeners here in Helsinki.
Thank you, Nadia. So let's start off the conversation talking a bit about your expectations coming to COP. Many of you actually, before attending COP, attended a conference called the Conference of Youth. I was wondering if we could hear a little bit about that. What's its connection to COP? And what's the feeling like there? What kind of, do you discuss the same issues? Does it work similarly in the terms of, in the process? And what is the general vibe there? Who would like to get us kicked off?
We can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Does it work? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear now, Nadia?
Yeah.
Great.
Nice, thank you. I attended the COP26 together with Maya here, and youth from all over the world, actually. And the COP26, the Conference of Youth, number 16, is organized by Yango, that is the youth constituency within the UNFCCC. So it's the youth observers group during the negotiations. So the COP16 is a youth-led process where youth from all over the world meet to discuss the negotiations and the topics which we think are relevant and interesting. And when the youth themselves can set the agenda, it is of course a bit different from the negotiations. But the advantages with Yango is that they really know the negotiations. So from the COP16, we have like a youth statement with like input from over 40,000 young people all around the world that is really linked to the negotiations. What I found really, what actually surprised me, what I really liked about the COP16 is that there was quite a balance between the people coming from the global south and the global north. Because I was kind of afraid, you know, we are in the middle of a pandemic. The most affected people when it comes to actually being able to participate in events like this are youth, and youth from global south. So I found the COP16 really, really useful as a preparation for the COP26, but also like the voices of truth in some sense. Attending the COP16 before coming here really helped me to have the right voices in my head, I think.
And to add to this, what Amanda very well pointed out, it had also a climate educational meaning. So there were also young people from all around the world who didn't participate in COP26. So they just came and participated in this COP16 to network with other young people from all around the world, to get to know better all these topics, complexity topics related to climate change, and learn from them and collaborate after these events.
Thank you. Axel, Finna, what were your expectations coming to COP26? Did you feel prepared now that you're here and on the ground?
Well, I didn't attend the COI.
We can't hear you.
What about now?
Nadia, now? Can you hear?
No, no,
Can you hear me now? Okay.
no.
Great.
We can't hear you.
They still can't hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
Nice.
So yeah, I actually didn't attend the COI 16, but I attended another youth conference that was organized in the end of September called Youth for Climate. It was held in Milan in Italy. And it was a new thing, so it was like a pilot project developed by the Italian government and the United Nations. And there we had sort of, there was 2 delegates from each country that were picked by some process. We came up with an outcome document as well, but it was a lot less connected to the actual discussions here at COP26. So although it was a nice experience to network with different people and discuss these big climate issues of, I don't know, education, ambition, private sector, all those sorts of things, I didn't feel as prepared as my colleagues who attended COI. And there's definitely some work needed on integrating these 2 conferences of youth to make them more effective and meaningful when it comes to implementing youth voices in the outcomes of these COPs, which is not being done adequately at the moment.
And Axel, how did you prepare for COP?
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I prepared mainly through my organization, Push Sweden, who has quite a long history of attending.
I think they're not hearing you in the audience.
Then I'll take this. I prepared mainly with my organization, Push Sweden, which has a quite long history in attending the COP as an independent organization, because we, apart from many other organizations, we get accredited directly through the COP instead of getting government badges. And we also have quite a big work with capacity building before the COP, and we also provide that for other youth. For example, in preparation for this COP, we had a capacity building session just, I think, a week before the conference started, which we thought was really helpful, and the ones attending also thought that was helpful. That was mainly how I prepared.
Thank you, Axel. And soon we'll bring Helsinki into the conversation as well to hear about your reflections in preparing for COP. But I'm also curious to know, now we've had 2 weeks nearly, most of us, I believe, at COP. Have your expectations been met? Do you feel like everything was put on the agenda that should have been there, or elements missing from that? What's your general reflection on how your expectations have been met or not at the conference? The word is free.
Yeah, I mean, the whole purpose with the conference is basically to keep global warming well below 2 degrees and limit to 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? And if you look at the NDCs and also the outcome from this conference, we are not there. So in that sense, my expectations are not met. But then also I think there has been progress here. And we can see progress during the negotiations and progress stemming from the negotiations, but there are visible in other kind of agreements and promises. So I'm kind of divided, actually. And I personally really don't know if I should be like happy with this conference or not, because we have so much more we can do. And I don't think that the youth movement will be satisfied with this conference, because the demands of the youth are not like able to be met. I mean, the COP26 does not have the mandate to really meet the demands of youth, because youth demands system change. COP26 is not negotiating a new economic system. So in that sense, I think there's a difference between what youth demands and what the COP can actually negotiate.
Yeah, Fina?
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, it is a bittersweet feeling trying to be satisfied with what we got, even though it's not nearly good enough. And it gets us to think, can we really only rely on this process to bring us to where we need to be? And I think the answer is no. The process is moving way too slowly, and I think it's very difficult to improve the process to the extent where it is satisfactory. So I think we have to start looking even more to processes outside of these 2 weeks to reach the goals that we need to reach.
And we'll get to touch more on this as well when we talk about where we're moving forwards after this COP. But I'd like to cross now to Helsinki to hear some of your reflections on this first conversation about the expectations and the lead up to COP. I'll hand the word to you, Nadia.
Yes. So maybe Isaac, you could start. What were your hopes and expectations for COP26?
Well, being at the Helsinki side of COP26, it was, I think, a really nice chance to meet people and network and really find like a place in which youth can come together to find each other, because that's something that's quite difficult, I think, at the moment in a lot of places. There's been some connection with Glasgow, but again, I think I'd echo the thoughts of others that there has been quite a strong disconnect between what we've seen in outcomes and what we've discussed. And there have been some really fruitful discussions here in Helsinki, and I'm sure in Glasgow, but it's upsetting to see that those discussions haven't quite materialized in what we might have wanted.
Does anyone else want to comment on expectations for the COP this year? Yeah, Vera.
Yeah, I think I could comment on one thing that I think is, do you hear me? It's good?
Yeah?
Yeah, that I think is important to realize also that this COP is not about a new agreement, it's following up on the Paris Agreement and actually going to that 1.5 degrees goal. And so I guess my expectations going for this was actually doing that and raising ambition on the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, and having them actually reach what we want to reach, which sadly, coming out now is not really like, at the moment we're reaching 2.4, but of course, the good thing is at least it's not 3 anymore, but it's something that just needs to be continued working on. And I don't think we can talk about it being a failure, because then people lose hope, but it's a reason to keep fighting and keep being positive and transparent also about it not being there yet.
Yeah, it's pretty a tough job also to just keep the attitude, like keep a good attitude and just like, yeah, we can still do it. So, I mean, nice to hear some optimistic words also from you. What about you, Joel?
So thank you for having me. And concerning COP and expectations, I think one thing to touch upon what was said in the Glasgow panel, that somewhat the role of youth and civil society in general is to never really be satisfied fully, to keep the spirit going and to set higher ambitions. And we all know that these UN conferences with the major stakeholders at the table will never really fully meet our expectations. And I think we should find fuel in that and keep the engagement going and set higher goals for the coming COPs and find separate and parallel processes. I think these youth summits is a very important step along those lines to define parallel and even higher goals to really impact and drive change towards our decision makers. And here I see a very big value of these kinds of settings and civil society and youths in particular. So I think coming into COP, I guess we can be a little bit pragmatic in the sense that we will never reach our systemic change that we are asking for, but still seeing this engagement, these youth organization mobilizing with a shared and common voice, that's something I'm really happy to see, and something that is almost meeting my expectations of COP as an opportunity to meet and organize and set higher ambitions.
Yeah, exactly. We also had so many great discussions here with the key listeners. For me personally, it's been really valuable and also really motivating and inspiring. So yeah, but Abby, do you have something to add still?
I must admit I didn't have big expectations for this COP after having been at COP25 in Madrid, because I went with huge expectations there and came home really, really disappointed. And having no expectations, I am quite pleasantly surprised by some of the work that has been done at this COP. I was very happy to see what the US and China, their like negotiations and what their press meeting that was on Wednesday. But there are some things that need to be improved. Of course, we need better NDCs to reach the 1.5 degree limit, and then increased finance also to help the global south to combat those challenges, and also on loss and damage and adaptation, because we must not forget that it's not just about mitigation, even though that's really, really important.
Yeah, yesterday was the finance day here at the Nordic hub in Helsinki, and I think we all can agree on the point that we still have to do a lot within finance. It's like, oh, there's a lot to do, but yeah, we'll see how it goes. Maybe back to you, Aaron, now.
Thank you, Nadia. Yes, still quite a lot of work to do. We've talked a bit generally about the role of youth, but of course there is not one youth, and we're all individuals whilst also being members of the youth. So I was curious to hear a bit about what these different roles look like. We're here from different countries. Even within the national youth delegate role, that's been interpreted differently by different countries. And then we have people from different organizations as well. So I'd be curious to hear, firstly, for those who have been part of the national youth delegations, what does your role look like working with the delegation? Has that also met your expectations, and what do you think is a meaningful way that you can interact with the delegation whilst also being a strong voice for the youth? I'll leave that question open.
Who should start? Maybe I should go. So yeah, I'm Maija Kuivalainen. I'm Youth Climate Delegate of Finland, and I've been working as youth delegate for 2 months now, so I'm pretty new. And my role is to be a link between Finnish youth and our government, all the politicians and leaders who have something related with climate policy making. And I wasn't prepared to this COP at all. It's my first COP as well, because I've been so busy with organizing Youth Climate and Nature Summit we held in Helsinki in 23rd October. So I didn't have that much time to have some expectations for this COP and prepare myself. So my role here has been more like kind of networking with other young people and learning from them, learning from every people and persons I've met here and the events I've participated and stuff. And I've also been able to join the Finnish delegation to some meetings and some negotiations and be their representative in some occasions when there haven't been people able to join some plenaries, for example. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity, but I would love to have been more involved and kind of, be prepared and supported to be a youth delegate here at COP.
Yeah, I have a pretty similar experience where I was elected into this role, just about a month and a half ago. And the Icelandic delegation didn't really do a good enough job at preparing me for what I had to do here. They didn't really give me a role, so I had to just make it up for myself. And I was lucky enough to actually have a discussion with Alan Björk, who was my predecessor, and she explained to me what to do, what not to do, and especially not to bring high expectations, and that has really helped me. But yeah, it's a role that's still in the making in most countries, I think, and it really needs a lot of structuring and it needs more attention. So I want country delegations to really take a hard think about how they want to meaningfully include youth in their decision making, because now, yes, we can sit in the meetings, we can listen, but we're not being listened to in a meaningful way. Our opinions are not being taken into account when it comes to the negotiation table. So that's something that really needs to change. Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you like to add anything, Amanda, about this meaningful, how can you make this a more meaningful connection, you think?
Yes. I think just including youth in the delegation is not enough, as we can see. It might be youth washing, it might be tokenism, so you have to make sure that including youth is actually leading somewhere. And I think that there are many countries actually taking steps in this direction. We can see youth delegates, but as you say, most of us are not allowed to negotiate. I think in Mexico they are actually allowed to negotiate, but we are not there, at least not in my country. So in Sweden we are an integrated part of the delegation, so we are attending all of the delegation meetings, we get to see and hear everything, and then we can give them our input. So we have, before the COP26, we have consulted the Swedish youth organizations and the Swedish youth climate movement, so we know pretty good like what they think about the negotiations and about the topics that are being addressed. So then we can really like pressure our negotiators on those topics and just be some kind of voice of like conscience in the delegation. Just being there, I think that affects. But we have to make sure that when we give input, we can see the outcome, and not only on the things that are easy to talk about. For example, including youth in ACE is pretty common, which is really good. I really like that it's like actually that we can see a progress in the COPs. But to really include youth, we must listen to youth when it comes to climate finance or Article 6 or loss and damage and all of these questions that are really important to youth, and not only the things that are easy to adapt, and then you can show that you listen to youth. So I think that we have come far, but there's a bit to go. And for me in Sweden, I think that we are improving. I think the delegation is really seeing us youth delegates as part of their group. But we're not where Mexico is. We're not able to speak, so that's the next step.
Thanks, Amanda. Another role that the youth often has, or is perceived to have, I guess embodied by the school strikes movement and Greta Thunberg, for example, is that of the role of the protester, so out on the streets and getting your voice heard in that direction. I'd ask you, if whoever wants to answer this question, but perhaps you, Axel, to reflect on what do you think the role of the youth as a protester is? We actually had a few other panelists hoping to join us today, but one of them wasn't able to because she went and joined a very important protest in her eyes happening right now, which we could actually hear through the corridors not too long ago. So what does this role look like? Both, I guess, within the conference centre, but there's also a lot happening out on the streets in Glasgow and in other parts of the world right now.
Very good question. I would say that there's this tendency to divide the participants here in Glasgow into those in the negotiations, within the venue, that are part of the discussions and so on, and those out on the streets protesting. But I would like to highlight that we share the same objective. We all want to influence the negotiations, and I do think that all these different methods are needed. I think that protesting, doing these big mass actions, show that there is a big interest among youth specifically for the issues being negotiated, and more specifically those who aren't negotiated. There's this big interest among youth to set the agenda and pressure our politicians to actually put the issues we value higher up on the agenda. And I, as one of the privileged people who can be inside here and listen to the negotiations as an observer, I see that my role is to carry on these wishes from those out protesting, those giving expression to their frustration, to their wishes, and making something concrete out of it, making sure that those demands are listened to. I think that's one big connection between those in the venue and those outside.
Thank you, Axel. We'll cross over to Helsinki so that we can make sure we touch on all of these exciting topics we want to get through today. Of course, it's very different in Helsinki, not being attached to the COP itself, but with our hub there, we've hoped to be able to connect you as best as we can. What are some of the thoughts arising there around the different roles that youth play in the different organizations that they represent?
Please feel free to answer the question.
So here, at least amongst us youth, we've discussed youth washing a lot. And if our role is actually being appreciated, and if not, why? Because like you pointed out over there in Glasgow, it's not enough to include us, you also have to listen to us. And in a way, I think also that a lot of the negotiators that are not politicians, I think that the politicians should listen more to them as well. Not because they represent often experts and scientists that are experts in policy making, and they know what we need to do. And my feeling when I was in COP was that like often the negotiators wanted to do way more than they could because the government wasn't on board with it. And we, of course, need to pressure our governments, but it doesn't have to be just us youth. It has to be the whole society, also our parents and grandparents. If that makes,
Yeah. Vera.
Yeah, thank you. I could also add just, I think it's always important to shed light on the fact that, as they also said in Glasgow, now there's a privilege to be there. Okay, there's a privilege to be in Glasgow, and that everyone couldn't be there because they didn't have access to vaccines. And I know that this is a complicated situation, but I think it's important that we see that. And there were even voices talking about not having the COP because everyone wasn't able to represent at that conference. And I just think it's a point that needs to be thought about and talked about, and maybe just a discussion, like, what can we do about this? How can we prevent something like this from happening in the future?
Yeah, you will go.
Yeah. Thank you. Just to touch upon what's been said already here in Helsinki, that our role not being in Glasgow is perhaps also to push our national governments in between different UN climate conferences and other UN conferences to build this broad whole of society approach and really lean on our governments to give them tools and mandates to bring in to these negotiations. And here, I think there has been some progress in the way of talking about the just transition, bridging in new stakeholders in the climate transformations, civil society, youths, labor organization, public educators, all that. But there is such a great work to be done in between these conferences to give the mandates to our negotiators to really drive change during these critical weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks is in the end a pretty short time. And there's a lot to discuss and a lot of people. So, yeah. Do you, Isaac, have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because potentially what this time is highlighted is coming from a youth civil society organization is the importance of these organizations, and actually maybe the negotiations do not go as we wish, but the importance of throughout the year and throughout the years to come, coming together as a society for this structural change and this mindset change, because it isn't just COP and it isn't just the negotiation that really needs to change. It's been quite positive.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go back to Glasgow then.
Thank you, Nadia. So hopefully we can still do one more cross to you after this one, Helsinki. I know you will have to check out at 1:25 British time. But I wanted to talk a bit more about the issues that have come up on the agenda at COP. Obviously, many members of the youth feel invested in a wide range of issues, but often choose to specialize in maybe one or two questions. And often those issues that have come up the most, maybe loss and damage, climate justice. Why do you think these topics are the most relevant for youth? And if you follow these ones, how do you feel that they have progressed? And have they met your expectations in that sense? Is there anyone who'd like to speak to that? Yeah, and we'll take out there.
I think something that should be highlighted when talking about what's on the agenda is that it's not decided based on what's relevant today. It was decided years ago. The agenda for the next COP meeting is already decided. So what's being discussed now was what was relevant for maybe 3 years ago. But, and I think you can really see two different agendas within the venue in Glasgow and outside. That the one within is the one reacting to what's already happened, while the one outside is the one acting to push new issues forward. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the reason why these two topics of climate justice and loss and damage are highlighted by the youth is linked to the fact, to what Amanda said earlier about youth being the sort of consciousness in here. I think a lot of the negotiators are a bit detached from reality and not acknowledging the urgency of the situation, while us youth recognize the deep inequalities that lie behind the fact that rich industrialized countries have been emitting so much more than the developing countries. And these countries are still not, after 26 COP, stepping up to their responsibilities in reducing emissions and paying for the damages that they're causing, the human lives that they're that are being lost today because of these facts. So youth is really recognizing the urgency and the injustices which are a part of this crisis. And this is, it's just not understandable why it's not on the agenda. And it might be linked to the fact that the agenda is, or the agenda setting is a flawed system.
Mm-hmm. And I guess linked to that, another key issue has been that of human rights and about Indigenous groups. And Maya, I know that you've been following this question in particular. Could you tell us a bit about how that's played out at COP and youth involvement in that question?
Yeah, I was about to come to this because the other group who have the understanding of this urgency of the actions we need are Indigenous peoples. And I've done many different things here during these 2 weeks, but I followed some side events related to Indigenous peoples and met them, some of their representatives personally. And one thing which should be more on the table is the human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples. Their rights to their own land, their water, their culture, their language. All these things are put on the side. They should be included in Article 6 better, as the Indigenous peoples have stated. So, I don't know, it's only my perspective what I'm talking to today. Here at COP have been few reps of Indigenous peoples, and right now today here is only one youth representative of Indigenous peoples left, and he's attending this what is the event going on outside? This parade, yeah, this protest. So he's not even here right now talking with us. But yeah, I've been following Indigenous peoples themed events, and we should talk more about them and give them justice. Stop eco-colonialism and all other practices our countries and states are doing right now.
Mm-hmm. Amanda, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to add, because I totally agree. And I also like, because I was at the People's Plenary just some minutes ago, and there is a service group for sustainability and disability, and the person speaking for them said that you should not, something like you should not talk about us, but with us, or like we have to be present in the room. And I think that is really important in the negotiations. Like observers are speaking last, youth within the delegations are not able to speak at the table. But I also think it's really important because what those observers organizations are actually highlighting is perspectives on nature. And I think that has to be included also. That is something I've been trying to follow during these weeks. Also, like, how can we talk about nature which is not very technical? And I think Indigenous groups, of course, but also religious groups and religious leaders has like a great importance in this, that we have to talk about how we as humans are part of nature. Because I think if we talk about this in a very technical way, we'll never be able to, I don't know, solve is the wrong word, but like face the climate crisis. And keep the global warming to 1.5 degrees. We have to talk about how we live. And I think that the youth movement is doing that, and many of the observer organizations. But that is another thing that is not included in the negotiations, and that is really hard to negotiate because it has to do with perspectives and how you perceive something. Yeah.
Thanks, Amanda. I think we might have time for one last round in Helsinki and then come back for one last round of questions here in Glasgow. So any reflections on that, Nadia, but also you can add in where are we heading to from now, if there's any comments that you want to say in Helsinki about that, just to wrap it up on your side.
Yes, okay, so yeah, any comments? And also, what do you think that will be kind of the next steps? What do you expect from the future or from the coming year?
I just wanted to reiterate on the points that you've mentioned in Glasgow on indigenous communities, because of course we have indigenous communities in the Nordic countries, and I feel that they have not been represented enough. Like for example, here in Helsinki, we haven't had anyone from Greenland. That also might be related to COVID, I'm not sure. But at the same time, we see that the new government of Greenland is really stepping up. They've put a ban to researching for more oil and gas in their country, and they are part of the I think it's called the BOGA. On stopping fossil fuels, where Iceland and Norway are not a part of that, and which I'm really disappointed in, especially Iceland, where we don't even have any oil fields. I understand Norway a bit better, even though it's really disappointing. And I think that what I hope for in the next year or few years is that we really start to include marginalized groups, whether it's youth, whether it's discussions on gender or indigenous communities, and that when those issues are being discussed, that those that are not a part of that marginalized group show up. Because I feel like very often if there's a youth discussion, only youth shows up. If there's a discussion on gender, it's mostly women in the room. And that's something that we need, that's a mindset that we need to change. Because even though we're not a part of a marginalized group, their matters should still be important to us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I also think it's really scary seeing how many people that are representing the fossil fuel industry at the COP. So that's also kind of alarming. But yeah, someone else that wants to comment?
Yeah, I can just follow up on it also, kind of, that if we think about why are we doing this? Why are we trying to stop climate change? Well, we're trying to save lives. We're trying to save diversity. Whether we're talking about biodiversity, cultural, human diversity, anything. So of course, human rights have to be included. Of course, indigenous peoples, all kind of people have to be included and have their voices heard. So we can spare this diversity. It would be an outrage not having that in the outcomes, in the
Yes.
Yeah, I think also looking forward, what has been a positive here, and I'd like to see more in the future, is discussion of the biodiversity crisis, because this is such an important issue, and in the past it has not been given the importance it deserves. And I think that is something that has happened recently, and looking to the future, I think that's something that we should really consider, as this is a dual crisis. And yeah.
Yeah, important point. You want?
Yeah, very quickly to wrap up. Just being here in the Nordics and in the Nordic Council of Ministers hub or pavilion, I think just to underscore the importance of cooperation and building partnerships between countries, seeing that the nation states are somewhat the bottlenecks in these conferences, whereas we know that the emissions are not territorial bound. So facilitating and building these broad partnerships between youths, between marginalized groups, and between civil society and the private sector, I think is something that I will look forward to going forward, to really create a strong movement to impact and influence these nation-bound decision makers in these conferences.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I think a good question for Glasgow would also be that, are we talking enough about keeping fossil fuels in the ground and cutting emissions and respecting indigenous peoples? I think that's just like, maybe, I don't know, it feels like we should just ask ourselves those questions and see what the answer is, because right now it doesn't feel like the answers would be so positive or optimistic, actually. But yeah, back to you in Glasgow.
Thank you, Nadia. I know that you'll need to disconnect shortly for your next event at past, but we'll continue with one last round of questions here until past. So thank you once again, everyone in Helsinki, and
thank you.
Keep the conversation going there.
Yes.
I'd like to pick up. Bye, Nadia.
Bye.
Bye, Helsinki. It would be great if you wanted to give an indication of this question by Nadia, if you agree, if you think that, I can't remember the exact wording of her question now, but you remember about fossil fuel keeping it in the ground. What is one word, one sentence? We could all, I guess, quickly answer that before we go into our final, more detailed rounds.
Well, if the question is if we're addressing keeping fossil fuels in the ground or not, then the answer is definitely no. We have about 500 people attending this conference, delegates on behalf of fossil fuel companies. The fact that we're letting them into this space is atrocious. I don't understand why they're here. Second of all, the negotiators on behalf of lots of countries are also not taking this seriously. So yeah, short answer is we're definitely not doing enough.
Any thoughts that you would like to add in the panel? All in agreement? Anyone against?
No. I definitely agree. Just to illustrate this, did you know that this is the first COP where the draft of the decision mentions reducing fossil fuel, and these climate changes have been going on for way longer than that, and we have known it.
Decades.
Yeah. So I don't know if we should see it as, I mean, it's progress, but it's also way too little progress if you compare what we actually need. So.
Yeah, and when we go back to this question about youth involvement and people in the streets and here inside the COP, I think that it's too slow to change the system inside. We need people to every level to make it happen. And yes, we need to get youth better involved in COP, and we hope that at next COP, every country should have a youth climate delegate in their delegations. And the draft of Paris Agreement, there it would be finalized with this line that youth need to be included to their delegations.
So I'd like to we have maybe a short moment left where you could give a final reflection or maybe a final message to negotiators and other interests here at the COP. As you said, the agenda is already sent for next year, but perhaps we could reflect on how the conversation was held and how it could be held differently at the next COP, and how we as youths, but also as Nordic youths, and here we're all about the Nordic collaboration, how we can work together to make that a dialogue that gives the best possible outcome in the eyes of the youth. If we could have one final reflection on that before we wrap it up for today.
You give us so many questions, and then you give us one sentence to to answer. But I think what is important to see, even if we are like a bit criticizing the COP because it cannot really meet the demands of the people on the street, we also have to see that this is where actually almost 200 countries are gathering, and we can actually see agreements, and we can see like drafts and decisions, and that is in itself incredible. So just like highlight the power that is actually within this system and within the COP, and then of course we have to use that. We have to use like all of the ways we have to reduce the emissions. But I also think like involving youth, there are some drafts really involving youth, but I'm also a bit tired talking about like how should youth be involved and the structures and stuff. We must talk about like the topics and what we actually want. So that is something I really hope for the COP27, which has been like progressing here. But then also to actually, like we saw fossil fuel mentioned, like reduction of greenhouse gas from fossil fuel mentioned this year, then I hope that next year we can see even more progress. But I also hope that before next year's COP27, we can see that the businesses has already like starting this road ahead, because we need everyone to work with this like in between the COPs. The COPs won't solve everything by its own.
Yeah, I think I agreed with everything that Amanda said, and I want to highlight that this COP and all COPs are 2 weeks out of 52 weeks of the year, so we have 50 weeks in between every COP where we have to do even more than we do here. The COPs are only to set the framework of what then has to happen on a national and local scale. So I want to highlight also that there has been some positive progress, and we're moving in the right direction. I think we can't forget that just to keep our hopes up. But our politicians, our governments, our world leaders have to a large extent failed us, and we need them to step up in the coming 50 weeks before the next COP.
Yes. Exactly, I totally agree what these wonderful two people have already stated. It's not black and white, it's so important to remember that. And to sum up, we need to give more space for youth and indigenous peoples. We need to give more space to hear and be involved better. So yeah, and what we say, not only be involved, as Amanda stated, we need to be heard, and what we have to say about these things and what needs to be changed, we need to listen to that.
I think it's time that the COP addresses the fundamental drivers of climate change rather than treating the symptoms. I mentioned that fossil energy was mentioned for the first time, and we also need to address why do we need to even combat climate change? Why has our need for consumption, need for GDP growth let us destroy our nature in this way? That is what we need to address rather than treating the damages that have already been done. Don't get me wrong, those issues are very important, but if we don't stop new damages from happening, then we have no chance of keeping global warming under 1.5 degrees and staying within the planetary boundaries.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Fina. Thank you, Amanda. I hope that this is only the beginning of a conversation that we can continue having together, even although our time has run out for our conversation on the stage here today, and for all our events now at the Nordic Pavilion. So thank you very much to everyone out there in cyberspace and in the audience and in Helsinki. Have a great rest of the COP.